The year is 2654. Humanity built a 50-kilometer long ship to cross the void toward Tau Ceti. Not with engines, with light. Propelled by the mirror of God, a network of satellites around the sun, that ark carried within it the species' greatest treasure. 100,000 human beings turned into living crystal, motionless, intact, waiting to awaken in another world. Only 500 people traveled awake to care for them. But halfway through the journey, something entered the ship. And what was supposed to be humanity's great colonization mission turned into a nightmare. Because when the Ark decided to return to Earth, it wasn't coming back alone.
We must return to the origin.
Welcome to History of the Future. The year 2654. 160 years had passed since the Ark left the solar system behind. "60 years since the mirror of God, that network of satellites suspended around the sun, cast its final beam of light upon the ship and sent it on a 120-year journey with no stops. No assistance, and no planned return. From the outside, it still looked like an impossible feat. A 50-kilometer structure advancing silently toward Tau Ceti, like a black needle piercing the interstellar night. Inside, the reality was different. The ship was not filled with awake colonists. There were no families in the hallways, nor conversations filling the metal corridors. There were no children running between the rotating gravity modules, nor scientists arguing in the trajectory laboratories. The vast majority of humanity, traveling in that ark, did so in absolute silence. 100,000 people. Men, women, children, engineers, doctors, farmers, artists, embryos preserved in fist-sized capsules, genetic banks containing the diversity of 40 generations, cultural archives holding everything humanity had decided was worth preserving. Everything necessary to found a new world upon reaching Tau Ceti. Everything the species considered too valuable to lose. Their bodies had been transformed to withstand the journey. Their cells stabilized with glucose solutions and cryoprotectants, transformed into a form of living crystal capable of enduring decades without degrading. They were life suspended, promises frozen in time. That was why they were called the Crystal Treasure. And everything in the Ark existed to protect them. Only 500 people traveled awake. 500 conscious lives destined to keep the ship running generation after generation, taking turns and shifts that measured time not in years, but in deaths and births. They would not travel to the end. They would not see Tau Ceti. They would not set foot on the new world, nor know if it was as they had imagined. Their mission was not to arrive. It was to safeguard those who would, to be born inside the ship, to learn to maintain it, to reproduce so that there would be someone to carry on, to grow old among metal corridors, to die knowing that their children would do exactly the same, all so that others might one day awaken under another sun. For generations, that worked. Discipline held. The hierarchy remained. The sense of mission was passed down from parents to children with the same seriousness with which other cultures passed down religions or languages. Each generation of the awakened was raised to believe that they were not mere crew members, but the guardians of the human seed. But 160 years after liftoff, none of those who had known Earth were still alive. The awakened had been born aboard the ship, in metal corridors and hydroponic gardens lit by artificial light, calibrated to mimic the solar cycle. For them, Earth was not a lost home, but a story. A blue myth told by parents and teachers. And Tau Ceti wasn't a real destination either. It was an abstraction, a point of light cataloged at the end of a life they wouldn't get to live either. Something their children or their children's children would see someday, if all went well, if the ship held out, if the crystal treasure arrived intact. Always for others, never for them. But the ship kept running. And when a mission keeps running, humanity has a dangerous habit, assuming that everything is under control. That habit was the first mistake. Life inside the Ark had the slow rhythm of what never changes. Maintenance shifts, system checks, and reports that always repeated the same thing. The ship was still on course. The awakened had grown accustomed to that monotony. It was the only way to stay sane. 3 weeks earlier, the sensors detected an unclassified mass near the trajectory. Dark, no nearby star, no breathable atmosphere. The system classified it as an insignificant rogue body and filed it away. No one thought about it again until the problems began. First, it was one of the major water recycling loops, with degradation exceeding what was expected for that phase of the journey. Then came minor failures in the industrial nitrogen tanks. The kind of minor issues that under normal conditions would be resolved within hours. But on a 50-kilometer long ship isolated in the interstellar vacuum, were never entirely minor. Then, minimal leaks in the thermal shielding of 3 tunnels in the northern sector. Tunnels that regulated the temperature of a block of vitrification chambers. That was what changed the tone of the meetings. It wasn't the ship that was in immediate danger. It was the crystal treasury. If the temperatures in those galleries continued to rise, even by fractions of a degree per decade, the cryoprotective compounds would begin to degrade cumulatively and irreversibly. And a vitrified body that begins to degrade cannot be repaired. It does not wake up. It is not saved. It simply breaks down. The technical council studied the situation for 30 hours without sleep. There were reserves to continue, yes. There was room to move forward and trust that the systems would stabilize on their own, yes. But it was the kind of chain of errors that, in a 50-kilometer long floating city destined to travel another 120 years without assistance, forced them to double-check every calculation and not rely on the margin. That was when someone remembered the file on the wandering planet. It wasn't what they needed. It had deep ice of uncertain composition and gases trapped in underground layers that preliminary analyses hadn't yet been able to identify precisely. There was also an exosphere with organic traces that the system still couldn't fully classify. Probably abiotic carbon, probably irrelevant. It was neither a clean nor guaranteed solution. It was a vague possibility in the only place they could reach. And that was enough for the decision to be made. Not with enthusiasm, no speeches. With the weary pragmatism of people who have spent generations solving problems with whatever is at hand, who have learned that in the interstellar void, there is no perfect solution, only the available solution, a technical stop. Brief, controlled, almost routine. When the first images of that world reached the bridge, no one felt fascination. It wasn't beautiful. It lacked the cold grandeur of the gas giants or the reddish, familiar texture of the rocky worlds that filled the exploration archives. It was simply dark. A surface without striking relief, without geographical features worthy of names, with an atmosphere so thin that it took the sensors several minutes to confirm its existence. There was a mist, low, dense, uniform, hanging just a few meters above the ground, as if it had no intention of moving, too stable to be the result of thermal activity, too uniform to behave like a storm. The external sensors registered it as a complex mixture of ultrafine particles, volatile compounds in low concentrations, and unidentified organic material. Someone mentioned the word organic in the control room. There were a few seconds of silence. Then the head of analysis said it was probably abiotic carbon, common in bodies of that type. Nothing that hadn't been seen before in objects from the outer belt. The conversation ended. The descent protocols proceeded. The biological readings were confusing, yes, but not alarming. And on a mission that had been isolated for 160 years. The words, "not alarming," carried more weight than they should have. The teams descended at dawn on the second day in orbit. 12 people in 2 descent modules, full pressure suits, level 3 filtration systems, standard containment protocol for worlds without a breathable atmosphere. Everything by the book, everything within the parameters established generations ago by engineers who had never set foot on anything like that place. The surface greeted them in silence. There was no wind. There was no sound of any kind beyond the one they generated themselves. Their own footsteps on a layer of fine, dark dust that rose in slow clouds with every movement and took too long to settle back down, as if that world's gravity couldn't quite make up its mind. The ground was hard beneath that layer, compact, a color that the sensors classified as deep gray, but that to the naked eye looked almost black. And the mist was there, denser than it had appeared from orbit. It didn't reach waist height, but it covered everything in a uniform, still layer that their suits cut through as they walked, leaving slow swirls that took minutes to dissipate. No sensor detected acute toxicity. No alarms went off. They worked for hours. They set up the surface drills at 3 different points, based on the coordinates identified by the orbital analyses. They collected deep ice from the lower layers, gray as well, with a texture denser than expected but still within usable parameters. They extracted gas samples from the underground pockets. They collected samples of the mist using fine particle collectors. Several sealed vials were labeled and stored in the analysis containers without further ado. No one spoke more than necessary. The surface of that world did not invite conversation. It was the kind of place that makes people lower their voices without knowing why. That makes them look over their shoulders even when there is nothing to look at. That makes them work a little faster than protocol requires, without being able to explain exactly why. After 7 hours, the descent modules took off. 12 people. The same 12 who had descended. The airlock system scanned their suits, performed the standard decontamination procedure, and confirmed that all samples were properly sealed and cataloged. Everything was in order. The airlock closed. The Ark resumed its holding orbit while the analysis teams began to process the collected material. In the control room, someone noted in the log, "Descent completed without incident. Samples in the lab. Evaluation of results in 48 hours. No one added anything else. There was nothing else to add. The descent team returned with 12 people. 13 boarded the ship. No one knew it at the time. The airlock scanners detected nothing. The suits passed the standard purge. The samples were quarantined in the Level 4 laboratory. Everything followed protocol. The mistake wasn't neglecting protocol. The mistake was assuming that the protocol was designed for something like that. The first thing that changed was the silence. Not the silence of the ship. Theirs. The 12 members of the descent team had always been loud. The kind of people who fill the corridors with conversation, with complaints. With a dark humor that only survives on long missions. But in the hours following their return, they fell silent. They weren't nervous. They didn't seem sick. They simply stopped talking more than necessary. They sat together in the dining halls without eating. They answered questions with short phrases, almost identical to one another, as if they had rehearsed the answers without agreeing on them. "I'm fine. Just tired. It's been a long descent."
I'm just tired.
I'm fine.
It's been a very hard descent.
The doctor on duty noted in his report, "Probable post-traumatic fatigue, observation recommended." No one ordered quarantine. It was too soon for that. That night, all 12 slept for exactly 3 hours. And all 12 woke up at the same time. What they described later, when they could still put it into coherent words, was always the same image. A dark plain, no horizon, no recognizable sky. And on that plain, something that had no fixed form but was known to be watching. Not with eyes. It didn't need eyes. It just watched. And as it watched, it learned. The onboard psychologists reassured them. Surface nightmares, they said. Normal after descending to a dead world. The brain processes stress while sleeping. But the dreams didn't stop. They became more precise. On the third night, 2 of the 12 woke up speaking in whispers, not in any language cataloged on board. It sounded like repetitive patterns, almost mathematical, varying in frequency but never in structure. Like a signal someone was learning to transmit. When asked what they had said, none of them remembered. Audio log? Medical Module 7, Day 4 after descent. It's not that they don't want to speak. It's that when they speak, it's as if someone were choosing the words for them. End of log. Hunger set in on the 4th day. It wasn't gradual. It was a sudden surge, as if something inside their bodies had been shut off and suddenly burst open. The 12 began to eat with urgency the doctors didn't know how to classify. Double portions, triple portions. They consumed whatever was put in front of them and continued with the same tremors, the same emptiness, the same expression of someone eating sand trying to quench their thirst. Blood tests showed something still unnamed. Their cells were consuming energy at a rate 2 or 3 times higher than normal. No tumor, no detectable parasite, no fever, just a metabolism that was no longer quite human, working to sustain something that was not quite them. Nothing worked, because what was hungry was not their body. The most disturbing change came without anyone being able to pinpoint the exact moment. Their eyes changed, not the color. The way they looked at things changed. They no longer followed faces with their eyes. They didn't look for movement. They didn't react the way a person does when someone enters a room. Sometimes they looked too slowly, other times too quickly. They could also remain motionless, staring at an empty corner or a spot on the wall where there was nothing, as if they were seeing something else, as if they were learning to look in a different way. A security officer wrote it down in one of his reports. It gives the impression that they are no longer looking at the world. They are cataloging it. The first confirmed case of infection did not occur among the 12. It was their doctor. Dr. Bisa had been examining them for 2 days. She was taking samples. She was recording vital signs. She was repeating tests that led nowhere. She followed all protocols. It was all for nothing. Her notebook turned up 3 days later. The first few pages were normal. Clinical notes, observations, stable parameters. Then, the handwriting began to break apart. The last page contained a single sentence, written with such force that the tip had almost pierced the paper. They're so still in here. They've been still for so long, so much energy. When they found the doctor, she was in one of the vitrification galleries, standing, motionless, with his hands resting on the glass of a capsule. He kept his eyes open, as if he were listening for something on the other side. That was when they made their second mistake. They kept calling them infected, because an infection is something the body tries to fight off, something that causes a fever, that causes inflammation, that destroys, that leaves traces. That wasn't being rejected. It was being accepted. It spread through the nervous system without destroying the tissue. It didn't replace anything. It added. It opened new connections. It used what was already there and pushed it a little further. It didn't break them. It rewrote them. And it did so with a calmness far more terrifying than violence. There was no rush. There was no rage. There was no hatred. Only purpose. The first time one of the 12 attacked someone, no screams were heard. Technician Oren was being held under observation in the medical module of Sector 4. He hadn't slept in days. He barely ate. He showed clear signs of disorientation, but no one considered him dangerous. They were just keeping an eye on him. At 3 a.m, a camera recorded him leaving. What was unsettling wasn't that he managed to escape. It was the way he walked. He didn't move like someone who was exhausted. He didn't hesitate. He didn't search for the way. He moved forward as if he already knew exactly where he was going. He entered the room of a sleeping roommate. The interior camera didn't show the entire room, but it showed enough. It wasn't a sudden outburst. It wasn't a blind attack. It was precise. Oren knew exactly what he was looking for. When he stepped out into the hallway, his hands were stained dark. His face showed neither horror nor madness. It showed relief, as if he had finally found what he had been needing for days. The medical report attempted to describe what had happened using clinical language. It wasn't enough. What they had extracted from the body was not random. There was a logic to the areas they had chosen, an anatomical understanding that Oren did not possess, as if something inside him had known where to look, where to cut, where to find exactly what he needed. The medical commander read the report. He closed it. He opened it again and added a single note at the end. This is not the organism feeding. It is the organism learning the host's anatomy from within. Then he ordered a total quarantine. Too late. Because while he was drafting that order, in the North Gallery, Corridor 19, someone who had not yet been identified as infected was doing something no protocol had anticipated. He was opening a capsule, not violently, carefully, with the care of someone who knows that what lies inside is valuable. The first capsule of the crystal treasure was opened in silence, in the darkness of an unguarded gallery. The rest of the ship slept, unaware that the most important boundary of the entire mission had just vanished forever. The first thing to fall wasn't the structure, it was the boundary. For 160 years, the crystal treasury had been untouchable, not by law, not by protocol, by something deeper than any protocol. It was the reason the ship existed, the reason they existed. Opening a capsule wasn't a crime. It was the end of everything that had given them meaning. And someone had done it. Command tried to cover it up for 6 hours. 6 hours during which reports were delayed. The cameras in Corridor 19 were put into maintenance mode. And 3 officers received direct orders not to discuss the incident with anyone outside the technical council. 6 hours that were of no use. Because on a 50-kilometer long closed ship where the same people have been living together in the same corridors for generations, secrets don't last 6 hours. They don't even last 2. By midnight, everyone knew that a capsule had been opened. And what they had done to the body inside. It wasn't the violence that broke the crew. It was the method. The vitrified body had been meticulously manipulated. Clean cuts, targeted extractions in areas of high metabolic density. Nothing random. Nothing the result of panic or madness. Someone had known exactly what to look for. Someone had entered that gallery with a plan. The head of security said it at the emergency meeting in a voice that was completely flat, as if his brain had refused to process what he was describing. They weren't hungry. They were harvesting. No one responded. No one knew what to say. The next 72 hours were the beginning of the end. There was no single moment when everything fell apart. It was a chain reaction. Rapid, unstoppable, each link shorter than the last. First came the entrances. That night, the Ark stopped looking like a spaceship. It began to look like a slaughterhouse. The first guard disappeared at 2 a.m. The second was found 40 minutes later in corridor 14, on his knees, with his hands pressed against the wall and his face covered in blood that wasn't his. He was still alive. He was breathing. He was trembling. But he couldn't explain anything. He just repeated one phrase over and over, his voice breaking as if he were still seeing what had happened right before his eyes. They were running toward him. The third one never showed up. When the security team reached the South Gallery, the capsules were already open. 4. The floor was covered with translucent shards, sugary liquid, and something darker that no longer needed to be analyzed to know what it was. There were marks everywhere, blows against metal, fingerprints, scratches, a drag mark that trailed off toward the lower levels, where the light faded and the cameras had been blind for days. The terror didn't start with the screams. It started when they stopped. The hallways emptied, the lights flickered, and at every intersection, every corner, every dark stretch, there was someone waiting. You couldn't always see them, but you could sense them. Breaths that weren't yours. Footsteps that stopped when you stopped. Something that knew exactly where you were, even if you made no sound. People stopped moving alone. Then they stopped moving in groups. Then they stopped moving altogether. They were hiding? In maintenance shafts, in ventilation ducts, behind torn-off panels, holding their breath. Waiting, and they would pass by. They didn't always run. Sometimes they walked. Slowly, shuffling their feet, searching, like animals following an invisible trail. Sometimes they would stop right on the other side of the wall, so close you could hear them breathing. And then, silence. A long silence, unbearable, as if they were listening, as if they knew someone was there. And they were deciding when to open. Those who survived spoke of that, not of the attacks, not of the blood, of that moment when you knew they were on the other side, and you didn't know if they were going to keep going or if they were going to come in. Some didn't scream when they found them. They didn't have time. Others screamed too much, and those screams didn't last long. Then came the sound. Something wet, something opening, something that shouldn't sound like that. The hatches began to close from the inside. The sectors stopped responding. The communications channels were filled with static, and dead zones appeared on the security maps. Zones where no one entered. Zones from which no one emerged. The infected were no longer hiding completely. They moved among the shadows, among the power outages, through gaps the ship could no longer monitor. Sometimes they were seen crossing a corridor. Too fast, too close, sometimes not. But they were always there, waiting for someone to fall behind, for someone to hesitate, for someone to breathe too loudly. And when that happened, they pounced, without warning, without fear, without stopping even if they were shot at. They fell. They got up. They kept going until they caught up. And then, silence again. In some areas, they began to find doors locked from the inside. Knocks, scratches, blood-stained hands imprinted on the metal. People who had tried to hold on, who had heard what was coming from the other side and hadn't been able to do anything. The ship became filled with hiding places, and none of them were safe anymore because they were learning. They were learning where to look, where to listen, where to wait. They were learning how long it takes for someone to give up. And in the depths, deeper than anyone wanted to go, something kept moving. Not in a hurry. Hungry. A hunger that didn't scream, didn't lose control, wasn't sated. A hunger that sought, that opened, that learned. And in the midst of all that, intact, motionless, silent, the treasure remained. 100,000 bodies, 100,000 still hearts, 100,000 living things, waiting to be opened, one by one. The Ark couldn't turn on a dime. A 50-kilometer long structure, propelled for generations, didn't maneuver like a combat vessel. It had inertia built up over 160 years. The only way to change its course was to do so slowly, millimeter by millimeter, with minimal corrections that took weeks to translate into actual degrees of deviation. The infected knew this. They had been working on it for weeks. The first sign came from the trajectory engineers who still had access to the navigation systems. At first, they seemed like scattered errors. Unauthorized corrections to the receiver sails, minimal variations in braking protocols, contingency subroutines activated in an order that didn't correspond to any anticipated scenario. No anomaly was serious on its own. Together, they told a very clear story. The chief engineer pieced them together in a single night. He spent 4 hours plotting each modification on the navigation map. When he finished, his hands were shaking. He called the captain. He showed him the map. And he uttered a single sentence. "We're not going to Tau Ceti." The infected didn't speak of Earth as if it were a plan. They described it as a physical certainty, something they felt in their bodies before they thought about it in their minds. They described it as shrouded in low-hanging clouds, damp, immense, fertile. They didn't refer to it as a home. They referred to it as a destination. We must return to the origin.
We must return to the origin.
We must return to the origin. They repeated it in the hallways. They murmured it in the dark corridors. They wrote it on the walls in a handwriting that changed as the infection progressed. Increasingly geometric, more repetitive, more like the patterns the 12 had murmured in their sleep on the first night. As if it were no longer they who were writing. The lucid survivors attempted one last desperate act: to recover the navigation core. The assault lasted 11 minutes. 11 minutes of combat in narrow corridors where the advantage always belonged to the defenders. The infected did not scream. They did not threaten. They fought with cold efficiency, without visible fear, without hesitation, as if pain were merely information they processed and discarded. Of the 22 who entered, 9 managed to reach the core. It took them 3 minutes to realize it was already too late. The systems had been rewritten at such a deep level that reversing the modifications would require weeks of work. And the engineers capable of doing so no longer existed, or were no longer trustworthy. One of the 9 sat down at the console. He looked at the screen and said quietly, "It's done." That was when the commander understood the second part, the worst part. If the Ark returned to the solar system damaged, with sections without power, faint but detectable signs of life, and thousands of cryogenically frozen individuals apparently intact, humanity would open its doors. Of course it would. It was the Ark. It was the crystal treasure. It was the greatest mission in history returning after generations of silence. No one would see it as a threat. They would see it as a miracle, as thousands of colonists who could still be rescued. They would send ships. They would send doctors. They would do exactly what that organization needed them to do. The transmission was intercepted 3 hours later. It had been broadcast from the navigation core and programmed weeks earlier to activate automatically upon entering the range of any human listening system. Emergency return. Crew affected by systemic pathology. Human cargo recoverable. Requesting reception and assistance protocol. The commander read it twice. The message sounded like a plea. It was a trap. No one on Earth would have a second thought. No one would ask what was inside those bodies before opening them. The last lucid survivors gathered in the only sector they still controlled. 19 people. 19 of the 500 who had begun that stop weeks earlier. Their options were few, and all of them were bad. Destroy the propulsion core. Send out a warning signal. Sabotage the tunnel support systems. Every option presented the same problem. They needed access to systems they no longer controlled. Time they didn't have. People who no longer existed. One of them said it out loud, with the exhausted calm of someone who no longer feels fear because they have no energy left to do so. "We can't call for help. Calling for help is opening the door." No one answered. They all knew he was right. Any signal they sent would be intercepted. Any warning would arrive, along with a return transmission. They would interpret it as the delirium of a sick crew. The trap had been designed with too much precision. They had used the right words. They had anticipated every possible response. The 19, locked in a sector that was shrinking by the hour, realized that for the weeks they had been the last obstacles to something that had already won. The Ark continued on its new course in silence. In the galleries, the vitrified beings remained motionless, seemingly intact, waiting. But they were no longer waiting to reach Tau Ceti. They were waiting for something else. And whatever lay within them had been learning to be patient for generations. The Ark entered the solar system silently. Sensors detected it near Neptune. It was moving slowly. Several sectors were without power. Its thermal signature was irregular. Analysts classified the incident as cumulative structural damage and dispatched rescue ships before finishing the report. No one doubted it. It was the Ark. It was the crystal treasure. It was the greatest mission in history, returning after generations of silence. Humanity did not see it as a threat. It saw it as a miracle. The signal arrived before the ship. Emergency return. Crew affected by systemic pathology. Human cargo recoverable. Requesting reception and assistance protocol. 16 words set in motion. The largest rescue operation in history. Ships dispatched from 3 orbital stations. Medical teams. Vitrification engineers. Psychologists. Everything humanity knew to do when one of their own returned wounded. Everything the organization needed them to do. The first ships docked with the Ark 48 hours later. Controlled entry, medical teams on the front lines, isolation protocols in effect. Everything by the book. From the inside, the Ark smelled of cold metal and of something else harder to name. The upper sectors were dark. Some corridors were blocked. On the walls were markings that no one could immediately identify. Repeated geometric sequences with a precision that didn't seem human, although they had clearly been drawn by human hands. The teams advanced toward the vitrification galleries. What they found left them speechless. Rows and rows of intact capsules. Motionless bodies behind the glass. 70,000 vitrified individuals in apparently good condition after generations of travel. No one asked where the remaining 30,000 were. There was too much urgency, too much hope, too much historical baggage weighing them down. The resuscitation efforts began. The first one was broadcast live. The whole world was watching. The process went smoothly. Gradual warming, rehydration, cellular reactivation. The body responded. Pulse, neurological activity, stable vital signs. For a few seconds, everything worked. Then something happened that didn't appear in any report. It wasn't violent. It wasn't immediate. It was a minor deviation, an out-of-pattern response, a movement that did not correspond to the state of resuscitation. The live broadcast was interrupted 40 seconds later. No explanation, no statement, only silence. What happened in the hours that followed was never fully documented. Broadcasts cut off mid-sentence, reports that ended abruptly, audio recordings in which voices spoke with increasing urgency and then fell silent without anyone cutting the channel. A doctor on the team managed to send a message before communications were restricted.
Don't wake them.
It said, "Don't wake them. Don't wake them. They aren't asleep. They've been waiting for years." By the time someone read the message, it was already too late, because what lay within those bodies hadn't quite awakened yet. It had been waiting for that moment for generations. The collapse inside the Ark, the war between the sectors, the infected, the 19 survivors locked in their final corridor. It had all been part of the mechanism, the way to take control, the way to ensure the return. The Ark did not return as a defeated ship. It returned as what it had been from the moment they closed the airlock with the descent team inside. A transport system that had fulfilled its purpose. And humanity, With all its urgency, its hope, and its generosity, opened the doors willingly. It wasn't a war. It wasn't an invasion that could be named and remembered. It was something much simpler and much more irreversible. Something that only needed time and a way back. Humanity gave it both. And when it finally understood what it had let in, there was no way to close the door anymore.